Boldwood presents Copycat, written by Diane Saxon and read by Katie Sobey. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Monday, the 3rd of February, 21:15 hours. Dark laughter bubbled up from the depths of his blackened soul and reverberated around the four walls of the single accommodation concrete cell in HM Long Lartin prison. He blinked in the dimness of the grey light that was never quite dark enough as he slipped the burner phone from his pocket. Odds were it would be confiscated within a couple of days, as soon as the prison guards did their next sweep, but it wasn't difficult to hide a SIM card. Searches weren't always as thorough as they should be, especially if the guard was a lazy ass. They got that way when you nurtured them, lulled them into a false sense of security by behaving well enough until they trusted you. He depressed the side button for a moment before he let the basic retro dumb phone kickstart. With a battery life of almost a month, the phone was easily disposable and cheap to replace, provided he could persuade one of the new boys to pick it up from where his mate lobbed it over the wall. It was never an issue, provided he also persuaded him to put a few tabs in with it as a reward for the collector. A quiver buzzed through his warmed blood, and he stifled the excitement before it turned to a raging torrent of uncontrollable exhilaration. He clamped his jaw closed, air hissing through his clenched teeth as he shaded the overly bright screen with his meaty fist and squinted at the single text. It didn't matter if the number was blocked. He had no intention of replying. He didn't need evidence of a link between them, but the connection would be more than obvious. His lips kicked up at the sides. Another evil chuckle escaped him as he scanned the single word. Soon. Chapter 2. Monday, the 3rd of February, 23:15 hours. The orange glow of street lamps flickered through the windows of the Uber car as Marcia Davies reclined in the rear seat, her head a gentle fuzz of alcoholic anesthesia. Not sufficient to excise the pain of her broken heart, just enough to dull it for a short while. She swiped her finger right over her phone to reject yet another hopeful candidate on Yellow, the dating app she'd recently downloaded and soon regretted for its useless addictiveness. She raised her head to stare out of the window at the insipid rain she knew still wept the icy winter's chill that seeped bone deep. She went to swipe again and clenched her jaw at the sight of the vague tremble in her fingers. Damn it. It wasn't like her to be a coward. She was strong. She'd withstood so much. Rejection, humiliation. She could continue to withstand the intimidation, the menace. Her chest expanded as she drew in a long breath and then blew it out again. She could do this. She had to do it. She didn't have a choice. As the Uber drew up outside her compact two-bedroom terrace house in Lawley, a ripple of fear threaded through her. Fear of what she'd find this time. When she and Ray had bought one of the brand-new homes in the Telford expansion phase 2 years previously, she'd lavished her love on the place, and him. On the outer edges of Telford, it was a short hop to spill over into Ironbridge and beyond to Much Wenlock. An idyllic village lifestyle located so it was just as easy to reach the M54 as it was the farmers' fields. Instead of sharing space with Ray's mother and stepfather, as they had for several years until they'd saved the deposit for their house, she'd taken pride in furnishing her own space. Delighted that for the first time in her life, she had something that would reflect her taste, her style. Unfortunately, Ray had not been of the same mind. He hadn't even had the decency to leave her for a younger woman. Not that he could have found anyone much younger than Marcia when he'd met her. She'd been 17, 18, and still at university when they moved in with his mother and stepfather together. Once qualified, she'd thought the world was at her feet, and within the span of a few short years, the prospect of promotion had been a viable one. They'd lived the golden life. The peace and tranquility of a suburban lifestyle, with the security of neighbours she'd barely had the chance to get to know as everyone worked. Her shifts at the Princess Royal, Telford's main hospital, rarely afforded her the opportunity to make friends outside her own circle of work colleagues. She'd been happy enough with that arrangement. Until recently. Until she'd been ostracised by half of her work colleagues, and the other half treated her as though she was about to break apart. She was. She stared at the for sale sign in the neat patch of a front garden as it dripped with rain and misery. The security she believed she had disappeared in a wisp of mist as she glanced at the house that no longer felt like her home. Not since Ray had left. The fast clench in her stomach had her gripping the phone to her chest. He may have left, but she'd been unable to stop him from returning. "You all right, Bab?" Powerful Birmingham laced the driver's words. The gentle term of endearment pulled her back to the present while she stared blankly at the taxi driver, her gaze meeting the watery blue of his in the rear-view mirror. She remembered where she was. Embarrassment surged through her to nudge away the blur of alcohol. She fumbled as she dipped her hand hastily into her purse for the fare while he turned in his seat to face her. "You're all right, Bab. He already paid for you." At her vacant stare, the driver nodded. "Your young man. Back there. He paid." Not her young man. Never likely to be. She zipped her purse closed, snapped her phone off, and slipped it into her pocket. Her gaze pulled back to the dark foreboding of the empty house. A sliver of dread prickled her skin at the prospect of getting out of the safety of the car. Ray had done that to her, made her scared of her own shadow, with his sly insistence that she'd lost her mind. The irony of it was, she had succumbed to the insanity of his mind games. His clever little tricks to make her frightened in her own home. Marcia squeezed her eyes closed and gulped down the scalding acid threatening to bubble up the back of her throat into her mouth. She touched trembling fingertips to her lips and breathed in through her nose as the heat of the Uber pressed in on her, thick and claustrophobic. She dragged in another breath, almost choking on the sweet, cloying scent of the cherry-shaped air freshener which dangled from the driver's rear-view mirror and gave an erratic sway as the driver hefted his large frame out of the car and moved around to yank her door open. The fast rush of cold draft had her eyes popping open as she heaved in a quick gasp of refreshing air while the biting wind ripped at the thin layers of clothes only suitable for a date in a warm, cosy restaurant, not a late-night walk, even if it was only to her front door. Icy fingers of panic stole along her spine as Marcia shot her gaze up to the darkened bedroom windows in the fear of what Ray may have done while she'd been out. Had he sneaked in to break another cup, move a precious lamp, take away a kitchen appliance? He'd already had the television, leaving her with nothing but her laptop to watch programs on. A shiver took a hold of her, and she clenched her teeth, her jaw popping in her ears. "Come on now, love. You've had too much to drink. I wish you girls would take better care of yourselves." An edge of iron had crept into the driver's voice as he held open the door, his face set in disapproval. "Sorry. I'm so sorry." Embarrassed, Marcia stumbled from the taxi, muttering a thank you as she tripped along the neatly edged pathway, desperate to escape her humiliation. Not so desperate she didn't hang onto the doorframe, reluctant to enter the house as her world spun. She should never have drunk so much. She stabbed her key into the lock, only succeeding in inserting it on the third try, aware of the presence of the Uber driver as he waited at the end of her pathway, his engine running. It should have made her feel safe, but the danger wasn't so much outside where the street lamps cast puddles of light onto the wet pavements. Her fear came from the silent stillness of her own house. With her back to the lawn, she refused to turn around and look at the single word Ray had burned into it with weed killer. She didn't have to look. It was etched on her mind. Bitch. As though she'd been the one who'd cheated, and he wanted all the neighbours to know. Well, they thought they knew, and oh, how they judged. She lowered her forehead to rest it against the chilly glass in the front door as the insistent drizzle seeped through her thin coat to send goosebumps chasing over her flesh. With a quiet sob, she raised her head, turned the key, and stepped inside. As she paused in the open doorway, more than willing to absorb the comfort she'd always taken from the house, a swift rush of fear washed over her to make her flesh crawl. Without looking back to check if the driver still watched, Marcia slipped inside and snapped the door closed. Her fingers trembled as she pushed the door handle up and turned the lock, engaging the 5-lock mechanism. She glanced up the darkened stairwell, her heart thundering. The silence pressed down. Disgusted with herself for allowing her imagination to run roughshod over her, Marcia straightened her shoulders and raised her chin. It was rubbish. Whatever the hell Ray thought he was doing, he wasn't going to intimidate her. The creaks and bumps she'd only heard in the last few days since he'd sent a solicitor's letter the week before demanding she sell the house. It was on the market. It wouldn't sell any faster just because he was trying to strong-arm her. It was his fault the last couple simply drove off after seeing that word emblazoned over the front lawn. Did he even regret his impulsive action in a fit of temper a couple of weeks earlier when they'd argued over the sofa? She'd refused to let him have it, showed him proof that she'd paid for it, and threatened to report him to the police. Just to prove he could, he'd returned once she'd gone to work, left the box of weed killer on the bench. It was a few days later it dawned on her what he'd done. He may have damaged the lawn, but there was no way he'd physically harm her. Surely. He'd loved her once. Hadn't he? Emotions rocked wildly with the adrenaline shot of alcohol, sending her from the edge of tears to anger, frustration, fear. The sheer cruelty of it almost brought her to her knees as grief struck her in a violent blast. Infuriated with her uncharacteristic weakness, she ground her teeth as she strode through to the kitchen, dipped her hand into her pocket, and tossed her mobile phone onto the smooth wooden counter next to the almost empty bottle of wine she'd managed to consume before she'd gone out. She frowned as she tried to remember where she'd left the glass, sure she'd brought it from upstairs when she was about to leave for the evening. She opened a cupboard and snatched out a clean glass, spilling the wine over the side as she sloshed the last of it from the bottle. Tears pricked the back of her eyes as she took a deep slug and allowed humiliation to flow over her. She'd made a mistake. She wasn't damned well ready to date. 3 months. It was hardly a lifetime since Ray had left. Barely a blink since he'd announced he had another woman. Even less when he told her last week that his new woman was pregnant. Another hard blow in a long string of them. She stripped off her damp coat and slung it over the back of one of her kitchen chairs. She hadn't the blindest clue why she'd gone out for drinks with the young police officer. other than the girls at work telling her to get back out there, enjoy herself. Enjoy, as if that was about to happen. Feel like an attractive woman again, they'd told her, not the piece of unattractive shit Ray had made her feel like. She thought dating a police officer might make her feel safe, just for a short while. She placed her hands either side of the small kitchen sink and hung her head low. Even that she couldn't get right. He hadn't wanted her either. She'd read it in his eyes within minutes of their meeting. Pity had lurked there as she drank too much, talked too loud, sounded a little too desperate. Pity and rejection. Rejection. It was the last thing she'd needed tonight. If only he'd been a little more interested and a little less noble. Noble he may have been, but he'd lied about his age. She hadn't minded a younger man. He'd told her he was 25. From his baby-face features and skinny frame, he'd been nowhere near that age. 21 at the oldest. She could hardly hold it against him, though. She'd lied, too. She'd claimed she was 25 when she was pushing 28. It just went to show what a soft focus camera, subtle makeup, and a naive mind could achieve when dealing with the dating app community. A quiet moan slipped from her lips and then stuck in her throat as she raised her head and held her breath to listen. Her own watery reflection stared back at her from the rain-splattered kitchen window she'd yet to close the blinds on. She never did. Why would she? It only overlooked the barren wasteland that was about to be built on. No neighbours beyond their small garden yet. Still, the pitch black closed in. She reached out a hand to yank them down, then halted. Eyes narrowed, she watched herself as she tilted her head and concentrated, sure the muted sound she'd heard came from upstairs. A sound she'd heard a number of times over the last few days. A breath, a movement, a quiet shuffle, as though someone was up there, watching, waiting. Goosebumps pebbled her forearms, making the fine hairs stand on end, the stroke of feather-light fingers drawing a line along her spine to make her flesh tingle and crawl. She blinked, eyes awash with tears, while she waited and listened, letting the rhythmic tick of the kitchen clock fill the silence in the room and mark time as it slipped away. She was working too hard, doing too much. She had so much more to do, living alone. Her 12-hour shifts left her exhausted. She breathed, her dizzy mind whirling. Ray still had his own key to the front door. Had he slipped in? Was he up there, trying to frighten her? The low-life bastard. She should have called the damned police. Instead, she'd tried to date one, to bring her sanity and protection. It had brought her neither, just a sick sense of shame. Poor boy. She'd contact the police tomorrow, report Ray. He was an arse, but an arse who had escalated his attempts to intimidate her. And he'd succeeded. Bitterness curdled her stomach. She hitched in a desperate sob. She took another healthy gulp of wine and watched her eyes harden in her mirrored reflection. An elusive trail of evidence of his visits greeted her each time she came home. The mean pig. Subtle insults, as if leaving her wasn't enough of a blow. Her favourite bone china mug, the one he'd bought her from Royal Worcester in happier times, in the cupboard, the handle shattered into several pieces. At first, she thought it had been an accident. Perhaps she'd caught it with another piece of crockery and not noticed. But the build-up of incidents negated that. Missing underwear, her newly ironed uniform in a heap on the floor, an entire roll of toilet paper dropped down the loo, the radio left playing. He'd taken the TV, the thoughtless moron. He'd bought it for her the Christmas before last. It belonged to her, and he'd taken it. Annoyance whipped through the self-pity. She'd bloody kill Ray if he'd decided to sneak around the house, the thoughtless little prat. She listened. Nothing but silence greeted her. To the count of 10, she let out her breath. In to the count of 5. Overwhelmed by a multitude of emotions, she squeezed her eyes closed. She was going to her mum's. The soft whisper of a breath stroked over her consciousness. Her eyes flew open, and she reared her head back. Her heart stumbled to a halt, then thundered violently, the wild thrum of it lodging in her throat to choke off her breath midstream. A ghostly shadow reflected in her window stood in the kitchen behind her. Marcia whipped around. That weasel of an ex-boyfriend. Confusion chased every coherent thought from her alcohol-infused mind. Dread crushed her chest until she could barely draw a breath. She opened her mouth, and her voice cracked on a desperate gasp. "You're not Ray." Chapter 3. Tuesday, the 4th of February, 00:15 hours. "Who the hell are you?" He angled his head to one side to better study her, curious to get a closer look after so many days of observing with the quiet thrill of knowing he'd made her doubt her own sanity. The alcohol he'd seen her drink earlier in the evening had slowed her responses, but not dulled eyes that sparkled with tears, nor taken the shine from her cherry-red nose she'd blown all too much while she sobbed the last few days away. It had been priceless to watch as her stupid, thick-headed ex had told her about the pregnancy. She'd broken then. The man had denied everything, accusing her of losing her mind. She hadn't lost her mind. She was right. Her mug had been broken, things had been moved, underwear taken. But it hadn't been her ex. He hadn't even been in the house, the coward. The only thing he was guilty of was the writing on the lawn. Eyes wide, mouth slack, she stood frozen to the spot. Poor, pathetic soul. He thought he'd lost her when she went out. Dressed to kill, obviously on the pull. She'd already had too much to drink before she left. A cheap bottle of red wine. Not to his taste. He'd taken a sip from her glass before he remembered DNA. He'd scrubbed it clean and then placed it very carefully in the wrong cupboard, just to see her reaction. But she'd not looked since she'd returned. Dutch courage, she'd told her friend on the phone just as she went out. Dutch courage. She'd need more than that now. She'd returned earlier than expected. He'd still been in the kitchen, but he'd soon shot up the stairs to wait. He'd been prepared to sneak back up into the attic space above the spare bedroom where he'd been waiting and watching for the past few days. If she'd brought someone home with her, he'd have had to brave the chill of her attic once more. But when she'd stumbled from the cab all alone, her distressed sobs echoing up the stairwell, he'd considered his options and decided the time was right to carry out the next phase of his plan. A little earlier than anticipated, but he had all the equipment he required with him. He'd stashed it in the attic. Anticipation fluttered through his stomach as he took his time to study her. Her haunted eyes sent out a desperate appeal, an appeal he was willing to help her with. She didn't need to suffer from a broken heart. Not for long. Pitiful little woman. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, effectively blocking the one and only exit from the room. As he crossed his arms over his chest, he schooled his features into friendly, approachable. He forced his lips into a wide grin, and a sharp thrill raced through his veins as her eyes widened and her sluggish brain evidently caught up. He could only hazard a guess at what she thought of the stranger in her kitchen, dressed in pure white personal protection equipment. From the fear slashing over her features, she had an idea. It didn't really matter what his face portrayed, the outfit said it all. She wasn't stupid. He didn't want stupid. Half the game was the taunting, the teasing, the breaking down of the spirit, so once he made his move, the game was already well underway. The thrill was in the chase, the hunting down of the prey, the cornering of the victim. When she recognized him as her executioner, the game would truly begin. She swayed, a drunken, rolling lurch, and reached behind her to lean her hands against the kitchen bench to steady herself, while he waited and snapped out a smile. She found her voice at last, recognition slashing over her features. They hadn't met, but she knew him. "What are you doing here?" He squinted at her, and then pushed away from the doorframe, heart soaring with excitement. Years of study, plotting, planning fell perfectly into place. Narrowing down his prey had only taken a matter of a few weeks. Yellow had provided him with so much information. Too much. It was so easy to prize personal details out of people. Flattery went a long way when someone was lonely. Sad. His lips twitched into a genuine smile this time. "You have the most beautiful hair, Marcia. I've told you that before." A brief flash of confusion flickered through her eyes before the fear dashed it away as he brought one of her kitchen knives from behind his back, the white light of the kitchen flashing across it. Only 4 paces in front of him, the scent of her heady perfume wound through his senses, the perfume he'd come to enjoy, the one he'd take with him for the memories the aroma would invoke. Yes, this was right. It was all perfect. Chapter 4. Tuesday, the 4th of February, 01:25 hours. Darkness engulfed him, disguising the tremor in his hands. He'd never killed before. He'd dreamt of it, imagined his hands around a woman's throat, tested it from time to time on various girlfriends, the thrill shooting through his veins like liquid nitrogen, making him an all-powerful being. A god. Not that the 2 girlfriends he'd tried it on had enjoyed it. The experiment had been short-lived, as had the relationships. This had been nothing like his previous experiences. For a start, he'd never expected so much blood. The warm explosion of it had still managed to penetrate through his thin nitrile gloves. Nausea clenched his stomach, pushing hot bile into his throat. Hands on hips, he lowered his head and panted out short bursts of breath, his lungs burning as his chest tightened. He swiped the back of his hand over his dry lips. A ripple of pride pulled him back from the edge to gain a better grasp of control. Control was what he needed. He'd almost lost it for a short while. His first kill. It hadn't been strangulation, but something much darker, more final. Once the single, vicious stab of the knife had been made into her throat, there was no opportunity to turn back, no relaxing of his fingers against the fine line of her throat. No redemption. It hadn't been a clean death. He could see that now, would know what to do next time. He'd not plunged the knife deep enough into her throat to make it a swift end. He'd fudged it. No matter how much he'd studied, he'd been unprepared for the reality of it. It should have been a deep slash, ear to ear, rather than a stab and pull. He knew that now. Next time would be cleaner, more efficient. Despite his plan, it had all been too rushed. He wiped the blood from her kitchen knife and placed it neatly on her countertop as he stared down at her. He'd not anticipated the terror that had her rushing towards him, spoiling the whole plan of controlled fear. With one punch to the face, he'd stunned her. That's where he'd made his first mistake. He should have gagged her, tied her up straight away, and then taken his time. He could have used one of the 2 ladder-back kitchen chairs from around her small drop-leaf table in the corner. She'd have been in position then. He could have used her beautiful red hair, wrapped it around his fist to pull her head back and expose the whiteness of her throat. Instead, adrenaline still boiling in his stomach, as she dropped to her knees on the floor in front of him, he had shoved the knife straight into her throat. Eyes wide with shock, she'd wrapped her hands around her neck to staunch the flow. When the blood spilled, thick and glutinous, soaking its heat through his gloved hands, he'd panicked, never imagining blood had the power to spread with such energy. Not a thin trickle, but short, hard spurts of crimson liquid straight from the carotid artery. Worse still, no one had ever described the sound, the desperate gasp and bubble which filled his head, the accompanying gagging from her as she struggled to draw in that precious last breath of air while her lungs filled to drown her in her own bodily fluids. The hopeless struggle as she thrashed against the cream tiles of her kitchen floor, sending blood splatter in a pattern up the kitchen units and across the magnolia tiles of her perfect, pristine house. As she crumpled to the floor, he'd stepped back, out of reach of the spray of blood, fascination chasing away the nausea, while the woman's limbs slowed their frenzied grasp on life as she dug her heels down to gain purchase on the slippery floor. The last of her blood pumped ever slower to soak through the thin, man-made fibre of the dress which barely covered her. He hunkered down beside her, leaning his head close to hers to engage in the last precious seconds of her consciousness before the desperation in her eyes faded to leave a bleak emptiness, regret and sorrow sliding away to nothing. Curious, he leaned back on his heels to observe, while her right foot gave one last twitch, then all movement ceased. Bright copper hair, matted in the stickiness of her blood, pooled out in a halo around her angled head. Distracted with every feature of his kill, he studied her inch by inch. Her position on the floor, the way the pool of blood bloomed like an opening rose and then dribbled in straight lines where the grout formed grooves. His purpose slipped away as he absorbed every interesting detail. With a jerk, his brain engaged again. A zap of static kick-started his thought process. He straightened, stretching out the taut muscles in his back, the crack and grind of them reminding him he'd taken so much longer than he'd intended, long enough to have forgotten his next move. He strode to the kitchen window, jerked the blind down, not that the house was overlooked, but just in case. He blew out a breath and turned to face the scene. Never to lose sight of the purpose. He twisted his lips, a lick of irritation tightened his chest. He'd lost sight easy enough, straight into a dream world of crimson pools and gaping wounds. But he was back. With a careless swipe, he smeared the blood from his nitrile-gloved hands onto the trouser legs of his white PPE suit while he gazed around at the literal bloodbath she'd created with her messy death. His heart still hammered hard against his ribcage despite his attempt to control it. He needed to get a grip, clean up the mess. A mess far worse than he could have imagined. Stupid of him not to have realized. The volume of blood in one body contained between 8 and 12 pints. Looked like she'd pumped out all 12 pints of hers with all her thrashing around, her hands grasping at her own throat to staunch the flow that wouldn't be stemmed. Who'd have thought it would leach so far? He blew out a breath in preparation of phase 2 of the job. The cleanup. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He just had to move. Legs heavy, he acknowledged the shock had hit him harder than he'd believed. The drop from the adrenaline rush left him weak and empty. He glanced down at the white shoe covers he'd pulled on. Crimson streaks daubed them, but despite the amount of blood on the floor, he had relatively little splashed on his PPE. With a twitch of irritation, he moved to the kitchen doorway, swiped off the left shoe cover first, and replaced it with a fresh one, careful not to place his shoe directly on the floor. Once he'd replaced the cover on his right foot, he made his way up the dark stairs, conscious of not switching on a light, familiar with the place after 3 days of scoping out the tidy little house while she was out. He cruised his gaze around. He'd missed the place, miss lodging in her compact attic, miss the little tricks he'd played on her. It hadn't been difficult to gain entry. Her little key safe hadn't taken much to figure out. Year of birth. Why weren't people more inventive? She'd drawn the curtains in her bedroom before she left, and the soft glimmer of the bedside lamp cast enough of a glow for him to find what he wanted. He opened the second drawer down in her bedroom chest and pulled out the neat, ironed uniform. The memory of the original etched deep in his mind. Disappointment had his lips turning down at the edges. The practical green scrubs were hardly a close comparison to the old-school, pristine blue uniform with the matching cap and little white apron. He glanced at the time, speeding by faster than he realized. He needed to press on. He knew what the format and procedure was. He'd paid close attention, but the actual execution of it had been far beyond his expectation. The whistle of air streaming in through his nose in panicked gasps stilled him. He clung to the uniform, spread his arms wide, and invited energy in from the universe. Tossing his head backwards, he parted his lips. Muttering soothing words under his breath, he drew in measured air to expand his chest. There. 1, 2, 3. He pursed his lips and blew out, his eyelids flickering as bright golden lights sparkled behind them, pulling energy from around him. The control was back. Time. Time was his enemy, therefore he wouldn't allow himself to be controlled by it. Without consulting his watch again, he dashed downstairs with the uniform tucked into the top of the brand-new holdall he'd left at the top of the stairs. He chewed his lip as he stared at the dead body sprawled on the kitchen floor in a wash of blood. The loss of dignity in her death didn't escape him. He'd meant it to be a humiliation, a ripping away of all respect. With lips parted, he dragged in the overriding smell surrounding him. Tannic undertones coated the back of his throat with metallic wisps burning his nose. Sensations bombarded him while he settled down to clean the scene. A step-by-step guide to covering your own footsteps, cleaning your DNA. Deniability was the key. Leave nothing, and nothing could be proven. The gloves crackled as he rubbed his hands together and then reached into the holdall for a thick black bin liner. Each item thought out, planned. A quiet thrill chased through his veins to heat his skin. He appreciated the total silence as he took a moment to study her before he reached into his holdall and took out a thick length of rope. He rolled out a clean sheet of plastic and lifted her onto it, so she no longer lay in her own oozing blood. It was all an exercise, an experiment. Affording her no dignity in death, he took the knife from the counter and slashed the flimsy dress from her body. He soaked a bundle of tea towels in diluted bleach. He angled his head as he cleansed her body, wiping away the blood with swift, efficient strokes, her flesh wobbling under his ministrations. He curled his lip. Distasteful little liar. You're much bigger than you claimed on Yellow, by at least a whole dress size, possibly 2. And older, by a good 5 years. I found that out when I stalked your Facebook. He leaned in closer.
Yeah, not so obvious until you get up close and personal.
He chuckled to himself. With meticulous care, he stroked the bleach-dampened towel over her body to remove all traces of blood. He swiped at her neck, irritated as blood insisted on bubbling again and again where he removed it, no longer pumping, just seeping. Practicality filtered through a mind cluttered with the death of her, his first victim. He fished the thick brown tape from his backpack, tore off a long strip, and wrapped it around her neck, then continued until her body was clean of all traces of blood. He gave her skin a brisk rub with one of her dry towels he'd stored in his holdall, and then yanked her uniform on, tutting as inevitable smudges of blood smeared over it. He lay her down, her shoulders slipping from his grasp. The wet thunk of her head hitting the floor invoked a deep satisfaction. His belly warmed as he grinned down at her. Better dead than the pathetic being she'd become. He'd done her a favour, putting her out of her misery. He dragged one of the chairs closer, then lifted her body from the floor and positioned her on the seat. The dead weight of her flopped forward, but he arranged her using her hair to gently pull her head back, stripping the tape from her neck so both the gaping wound and her eyes stared vacant at the ceiling. Her shoulders slumped backward over the wooden frame. He took the palette of makeup from his holdall. Dipping his gloved finger into the blue eye makeup, he smudged it over the bronze she'd applied earlier. Not as neat as he wanted, he dragged his thumb over it, but only succeeded in smearing it with the nitrile glove. Her slackened lips wobbled as he applied the crimson lipstick. Little quivers of excitement pulsed through him to speed his heart rate. Next time, he'd extend it. Torture the poor soul as he'd originally planned. Irritation circled as he considered the cat-and-mouse game he could have played out, keen to observe the fear and the pitiful pleas for mercy. The begging wouldn't bother him. It interested him. The human mind. He combed his fingers through her blood-soaked hair to try and put it in some semblance of order before he held her head, one hand on the back, the other beneath her chin, and tipped her forward. He slid the hand from under her chin and let it touch her chest. He stepped back and gazed down at the thick layer of blood surrounding the chair. He needed to clean up. He couldn't leave it in the state it was. After all, the original had been cleaned. With meticulous care, he stroked the bleach-dampened towel over her body to remove all traces of blood. Anger simmered beneath the surface as he couldn't resist checking the time. He'd thought it was easier than this, hadn't imagined how difficult it would be, how much effort he needed to put into the clean-up process, how time-consuming. He'd far rather have left the body where it lay. He'd had the satisfaction. Now the killing urge had gone to leave him empty. He wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and then stared at the sweat beading on his skin. Tempted to use the second cloth to wipe it away, he hesitated and then smudged his exposed wrist on his PPE. DNA. He should never leave any DNA. He huffed out a disgusted breath. It was damned hot in her house. She'd kicked the heating up high, and he was about to suffocate. Why couldn't she have switched it off? He stared at his own exposed wrist as the thought swirled around his mind that he may already have dropped a bead of sweat. Too late now. A thin slice of panic wormed its way through the control. What if he left a hair behind? A droplet of sweat? His DNA would be in evidence. He'd be found out. With determined resolution, he cut off that line of thought, yanked the sleeve of his jacket down, and covered the offending, exposed flesh. It's not too late. I've not dropped any sweat. There are no stray hairs around. He turned in a circle. I'll clean up. The acrid scent of bleach burned his nostrils as he poured almost the full bottle into her mop bucket. He wrinkled his nose against the temptation to sneeze. Soon, he'd be finished soon, and the discomfort would be worth it. On his hands and knees, he rolled the plastic sheet as tight as he could and pushed it into a plastic bag, then inside his holdall. Then he scrubbed the mop over the smooth surface of the tiles time and time again. He changed the water in the bucket for the 4th time, slipped the covers from his feet, and applied new ones. Deep satisfaction filled his soul. The last part was the best. There. Breathless, he slipped the mop and bucket back into the corner and surveyed the scene. That was how it should be. The effort had been worth it. Perfection. His lips curved up in a satisfied smile as he contemplated his workmanship. There wasn't a thing out of place, not a speck of blood to be seen by the human eye. Proud of his work, he stepped back and snapped a photograph with the little burner phone he'd stowed in his backpack. He hesitated. His thumb hovered over the send button before he backtracked. He tapped in a few words, his lips curving in a satisfied smile as he pressed send to the only number that was on the phone, and then slipped it back away. He inspected the place. Satisfied. Leave no evidence and they'll never catch you. He grinned. It should be his motto. He could write it across the countertop in lipstick. But then the very thing he was wary of would become a truth, and he'd have left evidence. Ego. That's where they all went wrong, when they allowed their ego to surface. He slipped the remaining items inside his holdall and made one last check of the room before he stepped outside the back door and stripped off the PPE gear, stowing it alongside the plastic sheeting. He removed his generic black hoodie from a separate polythene-lined pocket in the bag and yanked it over his head, pulling the hood up to shadow his face. No brand names, nothing identifiable. Soft drizzle settled around him and washed away the heat of her house, but wasn't enough to rid him of the scent of blood and bleach. He drew in several long draughts of rain-fresh air, expanding his chest until his lungs burned with the joy of it. Despite his misgivings, he'd done it. Totally on his own. No one would ever know. The next time, it would be easier. He'd know what to do. It didn't matter how many times you went through it in your head. Until you physically made the kill yourself, you could never know, never understand the sheer perfection of it. A shiver of delight flowed over him. Such deliciousness. He cracked open the gate and checked each way before he slipped out, striding down the alley at the side of the house, his head lowered to avoid anyone seeing his face. His heart soared with power as he considered the next victim on his list. Chapter 5. Tuesday, the 4th of February, 05:05 hours. Dark satisfaction coiled snake-like in the pit of his stomach. Nostrils flaring, McCambridge drew back his lips and sucked air in through his teeth. He shielded the bright light of the screen with his hand as he cruised his gaze over the words. The first of many. Far from the pure thrill of carrying out the execution himself, he'd have to satisfy himself with the vicarious pleasure of someone carrying the job out for him. He touched the tip of his finger to the screen as pleasure heated his blood, anticipation coursing through his veins while he waited for the image to appear. Vicarious it may be, but each time she died. Satisfaction seared his soul. His hands were quite literally tied, his incarceration preventing him from carrying out the deed himself. A slow smile slid across his features. No worries. This was the next best thing. His work continued under the guise of another, but it was his mark on it, his style, his revenge. Revenge on the woman who'd stolen his life with her self-centered thoughtlessness. His mother, a nurse. Why hadn't she known better? Known what would happen to him when she took her own worthless life? The selfish bitch. He closed his eyes and let the anger surge up to close his throat and choke him. The vivid image of his mother's limp body slumped forward in the kitchen chair. A river of blood washed over her uniform and splattered on the surrounding tiles. The short, sharp kitchen knife protruded from her neck where she'd slammed it into herself, blood still pumping from the carotid artery. "Mummy! Mummy?" The little boy had grasped her head, pulling her face up to meet his. The smudge of blue tears streaked her face. The reek of gin filled his lungs. Drugged eyes flickered open. Empty. Soulless. The flutter of a breath hovered on her lips for a brief moment before her dead eyes closed. Her crimson, bloodied lips slackened. He'd learned later that it barely took minutes to bleed out from a slash to a main artery. Her death had been quick, if messy, and she'd left him with a whole lifetime of bitterness. A 7-year-old boy put in the system, pushed from pillar to post, abused, neglected, all because his mother hadn't loved him enough to live. His fist enclosed the small phone. 4 bars registered. Plenty enough for an image to download. Far into the night, he waited with the dull glow of the screen turned to his face. His blood simmered, anticipation turning to fury. The first of many. But where was the image? Where was the fucking photograph? Chapter 6. Tuesday, the 4th of February, 05:50 hours. Detective Sergeant Jenna Morgan leaned her elbows on her desk and pressed the heels of her hands as deep into her eye sockets as she could without popping her eyes out of the back of her head. If she did, it would only be an improvement on the pain of 100 woodpeckers stabbing into her brain through her left eye. The low-level buzz of bright electric lighting in West Mercia's Malinsgate police station jackhammered through her head and stabbed at her eyes. "Night on the town?" With reluctance, Jenna raised her head to squint at her partner. A pitiful groan squeezed its way from her lips. Detective Constable Mason Ellis shot her an evil grin as he dumped his tall frame into the typist's chair opposite and wheeled it to the desk, bringing his head in close to hers. Unable to focus on him at such a close range, Jenna bowed back and swallowed the heave of nausea. "Girls' night in." "Ooh, do tell." He leaned his chin on his hand. "Just me and Fliss." Barely discernible, his eyes flickered at her sister's name. Then he grinned. "Well, you look like shit, boss." Only he could get away with speaking to her like that. He'd known her too long, and any sense of propriety had long since evaporated, except when in the company of other officers. "Thanks for that." She screwed her eyes shut and raked her fingers through her thick, choppy hair. She felt like shit. She knew it. What was she thinking of on a school night and the start of a 12-hour shift? She'd barely been able to drag herself out of bed, but really she didn't need Mason to tell her. All would be well if she could lie down in a darkened room, pull the covers over her head, and sleep for 24 hours. Oh God, she should never have had so much to drink. Her head still spun, but worse than that was the acid burn in her stomach. Saliva filled her mouth, and she pressed the fingers of one hand against her lips and leaned her forehead on the other hand while her eyelids fluttered. It was the Prosecco.
Prosecco?
Mason quirked his dark eyebrows. Yeah.
You don't drink Prosecco?
He sat back and squinted at her, pulling at his earlobe.
You've always said it's a trend for people who pretend to be what they're not.
He clicked his fingers as the correct word came to him.
Pretentiousness.
Gah, well, I was pretentious. I pretended to be what I'm not, and look where it got me. She peered at him from between her fingers. His face swam in the mist of her eyesight. I should have stuck to gin and tonic.
You drank gin and tonic, too?
Only at first, then Prosecco. The memory of it bubbled in her stomach, and she caught herself just before she heaved.
Bleh. Not a recommendation. You should never mix your drinks. I thought you were seasoned enough to know that.
She was. She thought she was. She covered her wide yawn with her hand and shook her head at him. We really didn't eat much last night. She breathed in as she tried to recollect. Olives. Her stomach churned. Prosciutto and sun-dried tomato bread. Her lips tightened at the memory. We were going to make lasagna, but... She gave a vague wave of her hand. I don't suppose you have access to a cup of coffee and a bacon sandwich? Spreading his empty hands wide, he shot her an unsympathetic grin as he leaned back in his chair while it creaked its protest.
Sorry, I can't oblige.
He squinted at her.
It's not like you to drink midweek. What were you celebrating?
Fliss. Again, the quick flash of awareness at the mention of her sister's name. Jenna's hangover fuzz cleared a little, and she paid closer attention to him. She's been offered a new job. Surprise raced over his features.
I didn't know she wanted a new job. You never mentioned it.
Yeah, she's not settled since she was... She hesitated over the word, still finding it difficult to acknowledge what had happened to her younger sister. Kidnapped. Heat rushed over her, less to do with the memory of the incident than the acid churning in her stomach. She rubbed the back of her aching neck and swallowed the excess of spit in her mouth. She says she's not sure she can cope with the constant sympathetic glances she keeps getting from people at school who weren't even her friends before. She feels she needs a change. Perhaps teaching elsewhere would help. Mason gave a solemn nod.
I can understand that. But with the exposure she got in the press, it's unlikely she'll get away with anonymity, no matter where she goes. It hit the papers nationwide.
Anger unfurled in her, temporarily overriding the nausea. Bastard press with bastard Kim Stafford. Who the hell keeps leaking shit to him?
Dunno, but when Inspector Gregg finds out, he'll rip their intestines out.
Hopefully, he'll rip Kim's out soon. He's not helped the situation with Fliss. I don't know if she's making the right move, but maybe because they won't know her, they won't feel entitled to give their opinion. Yet. He leaned forward to rest his elbows on the desk.
Where's she thinking of going?
Wolverhampton.
Really? That's a fair commute. That's going to be tough on both of you.
Tears grabbed Jenna's throat and squeezed tight. She should never have had so much to drink on a work night. The desperate hangover allowed her emotions to spill over. She hoped she wouldn't become a blubbering mess, especially not at work. She'll probably move there, if she accepts the position.
Oh.
The one flat word reflected his opinion and hers. Yeah.
You'll miss her, and that furry fiend of hers.
I'm not so sure. Filled with bravado, she forced further words from her throat, knowing if he pressed too hard, she'd be in floods of tears, and he'd be mortified if she cried over the Dalmatian. Domino's a pain in the ass. You'd have thought he'd have learned a lesson,
But no, he's just as exuberant as ever. She sucked in her upset for the sake of the man opposite. More comfortable with hitting people, feminine tears destroyed Mason. She was destroyed herself. She couldn't imagine her life without Fliss and the gorgeous Dalmatian. She'd held her close, both of them close, ever since they'd been attacked. Domino left for dead, and her sister abducted. She'd probably overprotected her, stifled her as she allowed her to do whatever she wanted, just as long as she was safe. Her beautiful Dalmatian dog, Domino, so severely injured, now slept on Fliss's bed where he'd never been allowed before. Jenna had thought that was the way their life was to continue. When Fliss had brought 2 bottles of Prosecco home, Jenna had put on a brave face, smiled, celebrated with her little sister, while inside her heart had broken. Which was why she'd allowed herself to drink so much. Less a case of celebration, and more drowning her sorrows. Mason raised his head and stabbed his forefinger on the table. "She's making a mistake. You need to tell her to stand her ground." Amused at Mason's opinion that she had any sway in Fliss's decisions, Jenna mustered up a weak smile. "She's a big girl now. She needs to make up her own mind." Mason shuffled in his chair and grunted, just as Jenna's stomach served to remind her it still needed to punish her for her excesses of the previous night. If only she hadn't consumed that gin and tonic before Fliss had got home. The wild sway in her mushy brain had her clutching the sides of the desk so she didn't crawl over the ceiling. Determined to centre herself, Jenna studied him through narrowed eyes as she could only imagine what thoughts zipped through his mind. "So, how's the dog walker working out?" Surprised he'd remembered the plan Fliss and her had put into place to have Domino walked on the days both of them were at work, Jenna shrugged to cover the little glow of delight. "She's good. Very caring. Pip Lovell." "Can she handle him?" "Him and 2 others. She literally has them eating out of her hand, walking at heel and virtually dancing on their hind legs." "That should keep him out of mischief." "If you mean it should keep him from eating any more of my kitchen, that is the idea." Mason chuckled, then fell silent, his gaze turning serious. "You know." With thumb and forefinger, he tugged at his bottom lip as his gaze skittered over hers and then away. "Yes?" She wasn't sure she had the patience for his hesitant intimations. Couldn't he just get on and spit it out? He pushed the chair away from the desk, almost came to his feet, and then slumped back down again. "Would it be weird if I asked your sister out?" At last. It had only taken him several months to voice what Jenna had known was coming. She hummed a soft sigh as she leaned back in her chair, her gaze directly on Mason's slightly pinkened face. "It would be about time." "Sorry?" "Mason, how long have you wanted to go out with Fliss?" "Well, forever." "Yeah, and how long have I been a detective?" His lips twitched. "For about the same length of time." "Right, so how long do you think I've known that you have a thing for my sister?" "Shit." This time, he rolled all the way to his feet and paced away across the room. When he swung around on his heel, his eyes had narrowed. "So why haven't you ever brought the subject up?" "Because she had a boyfriend." "He was a wanker." He'd have loved the opportunity to smack him one in the mouth, she knew. Jenna smiled. Indeed. There was no denying Fliss's ex had been a complete moron and caused indescribable damage to her self-confidence, but it was being attacked and incarcerated in a small, damp cellar for several days that had caused a huge change in her younger sister. She'd become more determined, more single-minded, and less sociable. It was time for her to get out, to establish new relationships, and Jenna could think of worse people than Mason for Fliss to establish a relationship with. She glanced up at him and blew out a long breath. "Look, ask her out. Don't, For the love of God, tell her you asked my permission. And, Mason—" With a malicious grin, she locked eyes with him. She knew how to wipe the look of relief from his face. "Yeah? You hurt her, and I won't kick your ass for you." The little glimmer of hope was pitiful. "No?" "No." With a flat expression, she stared him down while she dealt him more truth than he would ever know. "I will bury you. Alive. Where no one will ever find you. There will be no witnesses. There will be no evidence. There will be no forensics. And there will be no one there to rescue you. You will die alone and petrified, having pissed your own trousers several times, because it will be a long, drawn-out death." His eyes widened with each statement she nailed home. "Sheesh, Jenna. Do you have to be so bloodthirsty?" "I investigate crimes every day. What do you expect?" The look he sent her was pitiful. "A little compassion?" "You have as much compassion as you need. You know I don't do fluffy bunnies." She pointed her index finger at him. "Hurt my little sister and you're dead meat, pal. In the very worst sense of the word." Mason jiggled his shoulders. "Dead is dead. Anyway, she may not agree to go out with me." Thoughtful, he tapped his fingers against his chin. "Do you think I'm too old for her?" Age wasn't a particular issue for Jenna, nor did she think Fliss would think so. "No, I don't. She may, but you won't know if you don't ask." Mason smiled, relief washing over his face. "Good." He nodded and broke into a grin. "Great." Distracted by the glimpse of a familiar figure, she stared past Mason at the young detective lolloping towards them through the main office of Malinsgate Police Station. Detective Constable Ryan Downey, the son of Jim, their senior forensics scientist, seconded to her team when her sister went missing. His enthusiasm and intelligence had led to his position being made permanent, much to her delight. His loose-limbed swagger became over-exaggerated as he made his way past the new blonde administrator, who never even spared him a glance. Jenna narrowed her eyes as his gaze caught hers. She jerked her head in a come-over motion and curved her lips in a friendly smile. Like a deer in headlights, the young man hesitated mid-stride, his gaze darting from side to side as though looking for an escape route. Mason glanced over his shoulder to see who she'd pinned with a look, kept his voice down low, and mumbled out of the corner of his mouth, "Would you stop baring your teeth at the poor lad? He hasn't a clue what he's done. It's only 5:45. He's early, for God's sake." The smile zipped off her face. "I wasn't baring my teeth." Mason quirked his lips in disbelief. Offended, she snapped upright in her chair. "I was smiling." Mason snorted out a burst of laughter, half relieved, she suspected, to have the attention off him. She'd lost interest in any case. There was nothing further to discuss. Mason would ask her sister out. Fliss would most likely say no.